Good evening and welcome to the St. Paul Neighborhood Network. My name is Martin Ludden. I'm the Executive Director, and I'm so happy to have you all here. Big thank you to you all for coming out tonight, to our panelists here, and to the League of Women Voters of St. Paul and the League of Women Voters of Dakota County for doing the work to host what is going to be, I think, a lively and engaging and informative conversation, but also an incredibly important and topical and timely conversation. We're happy to have you all here. Please, if this is your first time at SPNN, don't let it be your last. Our mission here is to empower people to make better lives, use authentic voice, and build common understanding, and we do that through the transformative power of media making. So please come back another time. Thank you for coming tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Amy Mino, the president of the League of Women Voters of St. Paul. Thank you.
Good evening, and welcome from the League of Women Voters of St. Paul and the League of Women Voters of Dakota County to the program tonight. After a successful collaboration last year with the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis and the St. Paul League had with Ramsey County on human trafficking, if you were here last January and saw that program, we asked Erica at County Attorney John Choi's offices to let us know if there were any other issues that we could help to address, and she immediately suggested the Start by Believing program that has been put together tonight to help individuals, communities, and law enforcement learn how best to respond to survivors of sexual assault when reporting. The Me Too movement really gained steam after that, and then of course the Kavanaugh hearings were all over the media last fall. Finally, the Denied Justice series was published in the Star Tribune, and we are very excited to have one of the reporters on our panel tonight. Take a moment to think about how important independent journalism is. This series prompted the creation of Attorney General Lori Swanson's Sexual Assault Task Force to address every aspect of how reports on sexual assault are handled in Minnesota. We are fortunate to have two of the members from that task force on our panel tonight as well. Tonight, LWV SP is very pleased to partner with the Dakota County League in bringing the panel to you, and pleased to be working with SPNN. Steve Brunsberg and his staff are wonderful to work with and a great asset to our community, and we thank SPNN Executive Director Martin Ludden for sharing them with us. So for now, I'd like to turn it over to Mary Rice, who is the president of the League of Women Voters of Bloomington, and she will be moderating our panel tonight.
Thank you, Amy. Well, welcome everyone. As Amy said, this is a timely topic. Many of us have experienced sexual assault. For those of you in attendance, if you feel that you need to step out and take some time for yourself, feel free to do that. We have a staffed, safe healing space available. Please approach an audience assistant wearing a white ribbon and they will escort you to the safe place. For those of you at home who feel the need for support, please call or text the Minnesota Day One Crisis Hotline. The phone number and the phone number is displayed periodically across the bottom of the screen. This is a 24/7 line that will put you in touch with the service or agency that can assist you. Tonight's program is being televised on not just the St. Paul Neighborhood Network, but also surrounding neighborhood networks. It's also being live streamed via the Facebook pages of SPNN, League of Women Voters Minnesota, League of Women Voters St. Paul, and League of Women Voters Dakota County. Afterward, it will be rebroadcast by SPNN and other neighborhood networks. It will also be available on YouTube and on SPNN and other neighborhood network websites. I'll now introduce the panelists. Following the introduction, Ramsey County Attorney John Choi will introduce the Start by Believing program. He'll briefly share the findings of the Attorney General's Sexual Assault Task Force, completed late last year as well. Then each of the panelists will describe the work that they do and how it relates to tonight's program. Finally, we'll have our question and answer. Those of you here may fill out index cards and pass them to the end of the row to be picked up by an audience assistant. Those of you at home can message their questions via Twitter using hashtag StartByBelievingLWV. So the panelists are John Choi, Ramsey County Attorney, Jennifer Bjorhus, investigative reporter, Star Tribune. She participated in writing the Denied Justice series, which examined how Minnesota's criminal justice system often fails victims of rape and sexual assault. Commissioner Paul Schnell, Commissioner of Corrections, and former Chief of Police of Inver Grove Heights. Nicole Matthews, Executive Director, Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. And Sarah Colford, Board Member and Moderator for Break the Silence, and she's a survivor. John, would you please proceed? Whatever you prefer.
Okay, I'll just stay here.
Okay?
Good evening, everybody. It's a really great honor for me to be a part of this really esteemed panel and here with all of you as a community. One of the things that I have come to realize as being an elected official for since 2011 is that nothing will ever change unless the people want it to change. And I think today, in this time, we're living in a moment where I think there is greater awareness, especially around the Me Too movement. One of the things that I think is really great about that is I feel that there are more and more people who are the victims of sexual assault who feel empowered, feel supported to come forward and share the stories. But the sad reality is that when people have come forward in the past, going back a long time ago, even till today, our system of response and our community response is not where it needs to be. And so this conversation today is really, really an important one because I think in Minnesota, we're really starting to crack open some of the hurt feelings that many people have had with regard to the lack of response. And so one of the things that we embarked on a while back ago, and for me, my journey around all of this, and I'm so privileged to be able to be a leader in this space, and really my leadership comes from the people and listening to the voices of survivors. And I've been I've embarked on this journey as a former city attorney starting in 2006, working on domestic violence, sex trafficking, and just being connected to some of those voices. I've come to realize that around the issue of gender-based violence, there is so much that needs to change. And I need to say that as a man, because as a man, as a human being, I recognize the male privileges that exist in our society and the cultural biases that have existed to tramp down the voices of survivors. If you think about just the survey data that we have available, when we interview victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, there's a tremendous amount of people that will report that they have at one point in their life been a victim of that particular type of situation, crime, whatever you want to call it. But the reality is that no more than 20% of the people across this country who are the victims of a sexual assault will report their victimization to law enforcement. And so I have been thinking about that for a really long time, and I felt like that there were these cultural biases that were in place in terms of how these cases were investigated, but at the same time, not just our system, but our culture. And that's a big part of, I think, what we need to talk about, too, is that the culture needs to change, because ultimately, at the end of the day, that culture really kind of guides and directs our system response. And so for a long time, and we know through the report that we released in Ramsey County, through the Denied Justice series, a lot of that has now come to light. So we embarked on this vision with the partnership of, and I see Commissioner Jim McDonough, who is here from Ramsey County, but we embarked on a program or a initiative in Ramsey County where we wanted to unpack the culture that exists around the lack of support for the victims of sexual assault, and then take a really detailed look at the system's response. because in many ways, we have many, many instances, but it's like a funnel. And as you get down in terms of, because I'm downstream, I'm down here, but we don't get a lot of those cases that are coming to our office. And so we embarked on a 2-year study in April of 2016 to really look at that. And we wanted to, and at the same time, we developed a public health campaign with our sexual offense services and our sheriff's department, and in partnership with our commissioners to start talking about developing a new culture around start by believing, that when a victim reports to you, or like if you are a mother, if you are a best friend, that we start by believing, but also the system. And so when we looked at that system, what we found is that many times the investigations would be dead-ended, and they wouldn't be submitted for prosecution. And if you looked at those in detail, those investigations, there were lots of alarming things that we would see. For instance, just in terms of the type of interview, oftentimes it would be done over the phone. We had high dropout rates with respect to victims after they reported, but then their experience maybe wasn't what it needed to be. And so then we had victims who would drop out of the system. We also saw that there were investigative parts of our law enforcement that weren't being properly funded. And so you had investigators that had caseloads of over 300 cases. And if you think about it, this crime, and if you look at the penalties that are associated with first-degree criminal sexual conduct, rape, it can be higher than certain homicides in our state. So it's a very highly ranked offense, yet the amount of resources that we put into it was lacking. And so we released that report in April of 2018, and we said a number of things as leaders in our criminal justice group as a part of Ramsey County, and also our political leadership in Ramsey County. We came together and said that a lot of things in our system need to change, so that if we can build this culture like we are tonight, that the response from law enforcement, from prosecution, will be where it needs to be. And so that my vision and my hope is that we would get to a place that one day where if a victim of sexual assault is present, that he or she will be able to report that and not feel some of those cultural pressures, and we would treat that crime just like we do any other particular crime. And so I think that is the big challenge, and I really believe that there's been a lot of progress just in our office alone from 2015, and we started this project in 2016, but from 2015, 2016, we've had about a 20% increase in cases that have been presented to our office, and then every year since then, we've had at least a 20% increase. So I feel like things are starting to change. We have more resources available now thanks to the commissioners, and we've invested more in investigation. So I am very, very hopeful that over the course of the next decade that we're going to be making lots of progress. But again, it's an honor and privilege for me to be here, to be a part of this esteemed panel, and to help kind of frame the issue around Start by Believing.
Thank you. All right, Jennifer, will you introduce yourself and your work as it relates to sexual assault?
Hi, I'm really happy to be here, a little nervous. I'm a reporter at the Star Tribune, and I'm usually behind a notebook or on the telephone talking to people, and not usually the one who has a light on her, and it's a little unnerving. So yeah, I've been at the Star Tribune for 10 years, and I'm an investigative reporter, and the last few years I've spent a lot of time on criminal justice issues. And our project began a couple of years ago when my colleague Brandon Stahl, who's an incredible reporter, reported the case of Abby Honnold, a University of Minnesota student who was raped by another student. And her case was mishandled, and then another law enforcement agency picked it up, and finally he was convicted of raping her and another student as well, another woman. And when Brandon was reporting these stories, he began hearing how rare this conviction was. And that started the ball rolling. He started pulling some numbers and getting curious, and we were seeing things that were confirming that, you know, Abby's, the conviction she got in her case was an unusual thing. So we decided we really wanted to take a look at this statewide, and we decided to pull the sexual assault case files of closed sexual assaults from the 20 largest law enforcement agencies across Minnesota, ranked by the number of rapes that they report to the federal government that they handle each year. So they weren't necessarily the largest, like in terms of the number of officers they have on their staff, but that are handling a lot of these cases. And so we spent the last year collecting these case files and logging facts about the files, and we were reading them from the incident report when the victim reported the assault to police, and through any investigation that was done. And then we tried to find out if there was, if charges were filed and if there was a conviction. And we were stunned. The patterns actually appeared pretty quickly on as we started logging these cases and logging these facts about them, that very few were ending up in conviction, and worse, that there just seemed to be missteps all along the way in these cases. Sometimes the entire case would be one sheet of paper, and a named suspect wouldn't have been called, even though his cell phone number was right there. And things like that we started noticing. And so we dug into that, and we found women, mostly women. We were unable to find any men, and I know they are about 10% of sexual assault victims and rape victims are male. We were not able to find any that were willing to talk to us on the record. So most of our victims were women. And we began hearing their stories, and it was really difficult to find women that were willing to talk to us about what happened to them. As you can imagine, it's incredibly traumatic, and the idea of talking about this experience was really hard. But once a few women agreed to tell their story, it gave others strength that they weren't going to be alone sticking their neck out on this. And it snowballed a little, and we ended up with quite a large number of women who wanted to share their stories with us in print and in videos that were very, very powerful, I thought. It's very hard to sit through some of them. So they were the beating heart of this project, was all the survivors that talked about their experience reporting their assault to law enforcement and what did or did not happen and how they felt about it. And we started publishing the stories in July, and we were stunned by the swift and powerful response from lawmakers and others in the community. And it brought us here today, and I'm really happy to be here. I can answer any questions later. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Paul, could you please introduce yourself and your work as it relates to sexual assault?
Yes, so Paul Schnell, and I'm very new. Today was my 11th day as the Commissioner of Corrections, so this is very new. But my previous life really had been in law enforcement in a variety of communities, St. Paul, first Carver County, then St. Paul, then the last three as Chief of Police in Maplewood, Hastings, and in Inver Grove Heights. And just for Jennifer's sake, it's having been on the other side of that notebook of Jennifer's, it's nice that she could have that experience a little bit as well.
That's my comeuppance.
But I would say this, and I've said this before, one of the things I really appreciate is the fact that the Star Tribune did this story. It's not easy as somebody who has been invested in law enforcement for a long time to see the ways in which we failed people. And to have to own that isn't easy. And yet I admire the fact that that's what happened with this story. I admire the fact that people had come forward. I was always struck as somebody who has been in doing these investigations. I think early on in my career, these were some of the cases that I was assigned to do, and I was always stunned by the level of trust that that these victims, mostly women, would place in us. And I will be the first to tell you that I didn't always do it perfectly. And that there's a tremendous amount of demands that come to investigators. And yet, none of that can be used as an excuse for the ways in which we, in some instances, as the story pointed out, failed these victims. And I think we owe people much better than they got in many of these cases. And I think for me, what this really was, and I think working with John and I think really being the student of a whole lot of the advocacy programs along the way, who I think coached me up around what these issues mean. I think it made me more committed to this issue, and as John said, I think it's something that all of us have an obligation to do. Certainly, those of us who get paid by the people to provide these services have to step up. But all of us, every one of us, has a role to make a difference around this. And I think it does, in many respects, to start by believing and really unpack what that means.
Thank you. Nicole, could you introduce yourself and the work that you do as it relates to sexual assault?
Absolutely, thank you. Mani Dubaneshi Choi Indigenous Cause, Migazi and Dodame. My name is Nicole Matthews. I'm an Anishinaabe from the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota. I'm the executive director at the Minnesota Indian Women Sexual Assault Coalition. We're a statewide coalition with members across the state who are working specifically to address sexual violence and sex trafficking against Native women, men, and Native children. We're also a tribal technical assistance provider nationwide, so we work with tribes across the country on their response to both sexual violence and sex trafficking. And we also have a lot of members who are individual members who are not being paid necessarily by a program, but who are impacted by sexual violence, who may be survivors of sexual violence, who have shared their stories with us. They may have relatives who have survived sexual violence. And so, I've heard a lot of stories. I have personal experience with a lot of stories. And I also know that oftentimes our stories, stories of sexual violence in tribal communities, sexual violence against Native women, are not being told. They're not being lifted up. We're not hearing them. And I know that, I also know that, the law enforcement response is, it's improving, but we still have a ways to go as far as our law enforcement and our prosecution response. And I know that, we can do better. And our network of our membership of advocates and others are not only lifting up the voices, but are also providing in the community, providing advocacy, so responding to calls at the hospital and responding to crisis calls in the middle of the night. And so I know that, there's many, many issues and stories that I hope we can talk about tonight.
Thank you. Sarah, could you introduce yourself and your work as it relates to sexual assault?
So my name is Sarah Colford, and I am a survivor of actually multiple sexual assaults, stalking, and I was actually trafficked for a year. I'm very, very lucky to be here today to speak to all of you, so thank you for showing up. That means a lot to me personally, and that this conversation is happening. I have done advocacy work for probably the last 14 years, and with different agencies, different opportunities. I'm currently working with Break the Silence. I'm part of the board. I'm also a moderator on the Facebook private page. Our work at Break the Silence, we're really hoping to be able to break ground on our first memorial dedicated to victims and survivors of sexual violence. We are hoping that it'll happen this year. This is our year. It will be in Boom Island Park, and we are just finishing our fundraising for that so we can get all the funds to build that and hopefully have that open this fall. We also provide assistance through our Facebook page. It's private community, so if you want to get connected, connect with me afterwards, or I would be happy to share my information and get you attached to that Facebook page. We do host truth-telling events, where we provide a safe community for people to break their silence, tell their truth, and have people around them that support them and encourage them to continue to break their silence. It is very difficult to see the stigma that still lays with being a victim or survivor of sexual violence. Being believed is probably one of the most important things for a victim who has experienced the violence firsthand. Being questioned, what were you wearing? What did you look like? Those type of questions are very harmful, and I have done a lot of work in the last 13 years to speak with different law enforcement agencies to discuss how can we move to a less victim blaming. Why were you out so late? Those questions have been asked in the past, and they still have been asked. So I do feel like this is an awesome opportunity for us to open those questions and to fight against them, that those aren't appropriate. We have a voice, and we need to use them. I'm open to any questions as well.
All right, thank you. Now it's time for Q&A. I would like to ask thank you, anybody who has a question on a card, just raise your hand and wave the card, and a card collector will pick up the card from you. So we can get going on the questions now. When I ask the questions, some of the questions are general questions, and I'm asking the panel to just, whoever wants to start off answering, and if you get a conversation going, that's fine too. Some of the other questions are directed to individuals, so we'll get to that. The first question is kind of a general question about start by believing, and what the question really goes to is, what exactly does start by believing mean? Because when you hear, when there's a report of sexual assault, and the report is made, does that mean that it's necessary to believe that report, and what about proof beyond a reasonable doubt and all that?
Right, and thanks for that question, because there's a lot of, as the Start by Believing campaign around the country has been adopted by more and more communities, there's some pushback, and a lot of people question exactly that. Like, what does that mean? Because isn't the job of an investigator to seek the truth? And we're not talking about putting due process and throwing it out the window. What we're talking about is this general concept that, for instance, in any other crime, if Paul, as a former, now he's a commissioner of corrections, but if he's investigating somebody who broke into a garage, right? Nowhere, no police officer in the state of Minnesota is going to come to that situation and start with skepticism right off the chute, right? And so what we're trying to do is say that what we need to change from a systems perspective is that we start with this premise, because on the issue of false reporting, it's the same as it is for any other crime. There's no difference. That's been studied over and over and over again. But for some reason, there's this belief, I think, that's embedded in our culture and also within police agencies and prosecutors, that maybe there's people are making things up or whatever it might be. And so we start with that premise that nobody would ever lie about something that just happened to them that traumatic. And if they had the courage to report that we start by believing just like we would any other crime. And it's not just about the system's response. We also know from just learning from victims that the most important person, that first person that you tell, your best friend, a sibling, a mother, whatever it is, right? If we don't come to the table and we are not prepared for that conversation and start asking questions like, why were you out so late? Why did you drink so much? That can have horrific and devastating impacts on a victim. And so it's about changing that culture, whether it's from a community or a family perspective or it's from a systems perspective, that we start with that premise. And again, it's nothing to put due process out the window. Everybody is presumed innocent until they're proven guilty. But we can start with the premise that when a victim reports some horrific, traumatic thing that has happened to them, that we start with that concept. And really this campaign is a part of EVAWI International, and it's really a toolkit for communities across the country to start developing this premise. And people have done it very differently across the country, but in Ramsey County and in other parts of the state, and thanks to like Commissioner McDonough, got all of the city councils in Ramsey County to adopt it, but we also have a Start by Believing campaign in Rice County, Minnesota, and other places around the state as well.
I would just add that simply put, we from an investigative standpoint, we need to follow the evidence. And we start by believing, and we develop these cases, and we follow the evidence. And I think to John's point, when it's always interesting. I shared this with Jennifer even when we had talked. Just having done a lot of training with officers and being able to ask officers, and we know this, kind of what percentage of sexual assault reports are false. Oftentimes officers would talk about the fact that it's somewhere between 60 and 90%. Now, if we go into these investigations believing that these reports are, false reports are that high, will that affect our investigation? And the simple answer is it can't not. And so I think this, and I think when we think about this is not, it's certainly a concern because these are the people that are somewhat the gatekeepers of the system, right? But at the same time, I think it's an indication of what can happen, the beliefs that we can develop. As John talked about, the friend that they go to, that victim goes to make that first kind of disclosure. And they may say, well, are you sure that it went down that way? Because you were, those are things that just can leave a lasting impact and can create those concerns. And so we need to really debunk that and recognize that false reporting really is somewhere between 2 and 8%, well less than 10. And so we're missing and leaving behind potentially a tremendous number of these victims that are coming forward and placing their trust in us to thoroughly investigate their cases.
I will add something to that, is that if we say perpetrators are innocent until proven guilty, so are victims. Because oftentimes victims, what are you trying to get out of this? I mean, what we've seen in the media lately has been ridiculous. Oh, they're false reporting because they're trying to X, Y, and Z someone. We need to start believing people. We need to start believing victims when they're breaking their silence. Because when we don't and we shame and blame, we silence the next person who was going to stand up. So yes, false reporting does occur, and it is unfortunate. It is approximately 2%. Some places you'll see up to 8%, but it truly is a small, minute population in this. And you have to look at precipitating factors too when you consider something a false report, because could it have been a flashback that put them into a situation and they thought they were sexually assaulted, reported it, and it ended up being a false report because it didn't happen right then and there. It happened 10 years prior to that. So you really have to think about statistics when you are looking at them kind of through a different lens. It is very important to understand that false reporting is a very small amount in comparison to the reports that are made.
I would also say the way to think about this in community is that the majority of our victims don't ever report to law enforcement. And so in community, it's important to believe victims. And we get so caught up in the what if she's not telling the truth, that we stop her from even going further, from ever wanting to tell anyone. We do a Native Girls Retreat every year, and we had a survivor who was sexually abused when she was 7, and she said she told her cousin, and her cousin said, "You're lying." And she didn't tell another soul for many, many years. And so thinking about what that would look like if that person that she told had right away believed her, and how different her healing could have been if someone had believed her from the get-go. And also, I think we have a notion of who's telling the truth and who's not, and we have racial bias, and so our good victims look a particular way. And when we think about who's telling the truth and who's not, sometimes people have it in their head what that victim looks like, how she should respond or not respond, if she should be hysterical or not hysterical. And so I think, the more we can remove some of those myths, the better it will be for survivors, and the more freely they will want to share their stories and start to heal.
Another thing I want to input is false reporting. Sometimes people confuse it with cases that aren't charged. So if they aren't charged, then it was false, right? Not at all. We know that we're working on those statistics out there, and that we want to hold perpetrators more accountable. And I feel like we're moving in the right direction, but that is something that is a myth that people don't understand, is that if it cannot be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, it doesn't get tried in court. There is a lot of doubt when it comes to rape cases. A lot of times it's one person said versus another person said. There typically isn't a lot of audience around to be able to corroborate the stories. So just to clarify that as well.
All right, thank you. Are there any other comments on that question? Okay. There's culture, and then there are laws. And I think you've all referenced both. So I want to ask questions, and we have questions from the audience about both. First, with respect to laws, are Minnesota's laws regarding sexual assault adequate? Are there bills that have been introduced into the legislature that ought to be passed? And what about the definition of consent?
That's a great question, John.
So there's a lot of things that need to change. One of the things that I was very outspoken on, and this resulted from the Denied Justice series, involving cases in which the victim has inebriation and does not remember what happened. So as the prosecutor, if your best evidence is that the victim doesn't remember what happened, but maybe there's some corroborating type of physical evidence, that case is very difficult to charge. In fact, there's a specific Court of Appeals case that says you can't do that with our current physically helpless standard. The law, the way that I understand it, it was enacted, I think, for a completely different situation, yet we are using a situation where the victim is inebriated, and we're trying to make that fit into those words. And what we really should be doing, and this kind of goes to our culture, but we should put the issue on the table and say that if a perpetrator knowingly has sex with somebody who they should have known to have been unable to give the consent, right? That in and of itself should be a crime, right? And so that's something that is going to be put on the table at the legislature, and and I think there will be lots of cultural forces in play about whether or not they want to enact that law. But I think in order for to hold perpetrators accountable in that situation, just having it very clearly spelled out, like they do in Wisconsin, in California, and many other states, to say that that is a crime. It's not just boys being bad. It's actually a crime when that person is so inebriated, intoxicated, that they cannot give consent, and any reasonable person would know that, and we can develop that evidence, because there would be that evidence, then we should be able to charge them with criminal sexual conduct. So that would be an example. Now, one thing about culture, too, and I think it's an important thing, because we also have to recognize that we're not going to solve the issue of gender-based violence or rape in this country just by solely arresting and prosecuting perpetrators. I mean, we have a long ways to go, and we're, I think, starting to make some changes because of some of the things that have come to light, and I know that we're going to do that as a society. Once we, as a community, we figure out what we want, we advocate for that, our elected and appointed officials march us towards that vision. But we can't also fall into the trap that somehow arresting and prosecuting is going to solve all of this. Because if you think about it, think about domestic violence. A little over 40 years ago, the first domestic abuse shelter was built right here in this city in St. Paul, Minnesota, Women's Advocates. And since that time, and that movement has emerged, I mean, back then we used to think that domestic violence was a private issue, right? And if you had a good police officer who responded, he or she might say, stop doing that, and I'll come back tomorrow to just check up on things. But we viewed that to be a private issue, and so there was never an arrest. Now we have mandatory arrest policies. We have much more investment in infrastructure around the Violence Against Women Act. And as a community, domestic violence is not tolerated in our families and in our communities. We have that strong value. And from a prosecution standpoint, lots of advantages. We used to have a charging rate back in 1990, just like what we do around sexual assault. Now, that charging rate is just as the same as any other crime. Our conviction rate is, over 75%. And so it's just like many other crimes, right? But we still haven't solved the issue of domestic violence. And we'll continue to have that for the next 40 years unless we change our culture and think about how we raise boys into men. Because the vast, vast majority of those who do the perpetration are men. And I don't say that to indict men, but I say it as an invitation for all of us as a community to think about that and to think about how we change this culture of how we grow boys into men, to say that that's not what good men do. And so I've been trying to use my platform to get our community to really think about that.
That leads me to the next question, which is how do we change our culture? Is there something that can be done with the schools, our community leaders collaborating with schools in order to teach children about...
Can I add to some of the legislation?
Absolutely.
So Break the Silence, again, is going to work on statute of limitations. And that might not mean a lot for some people, but in particular in my case, my first sexual assault happened when I was 5 years old. And the brain does a pretty miraculous thing that it can sometimes take those memories and put them in the back, and then you don't think about them, and you don't deal with them until your brain thinks it's ready to deal with them. I went through an evening of flashbacks after 19 and a half years. I relived every single moment of my sexual assault, which occurred more than one time. There was not a thing that I could do. So again, this is very near and dear to my heart that we are working on. Break the Silence is working on removing statute of limitations, and hopefully this year will be our year again.
Are there any other comments on statutory changes? Okay, so back to the question on culture and what can be done to change our culture. Is there something that can be done in the school system or in some other way?
Well, I think there's a lot. I think that's a big question. But I think there's a lot that can be done, and I think it's not only in the school, right? Because it's also in community, and so, because in order for us to have a shift in our schools, we also have to have a shift with our adults, and with the culture that our children are going home to. And so we have to have a shift around accountability and around what it means, what healthy, respectful manhood is, and healthy, respectful masculinity. And so we need to have conversations around what that looks like. We also need to have conversations around also what balance and partnership is with women, and we need to have conversations about not just male-female binary, but gender nonconforming, and we need to be looking at the trans community and LGBTQ, and so we need to have broader conversations and ones that where it becomes normalized, and when we're talking about what is healthy masculinity, what does it mean to raise healthy, respectful boys and healthy, respectful people, community members. And I think it's different, in larger society, and then I think specifically for tribal communities, I think we have some cultural teachings that are specific in our tribal beliefs as well.
I will say there are a lot of resources out there if you have children and you don't know what to say to them, or you don't know how to start that conversation or when it should start, that contact your local sexual assault facilities. You can contact RAIN it's our nationwide program that can get you connected with somebody, because those conversations should be started young. And I am raising 2 boys. I have a 6 and a 9-year-old, and we talk about what does it mean to boys will be boys. We don't use that kind of talk in my family. We talk about, instead of teaching people how not to get raped, we're teaching people how not to rape. How do we move into that? How do we teach our children that? How do we teach our adults that? Some adults don't even know that information. And there are resources for you, too, if you need information about consent or conversations about sex.
I think the schools would be a great place to have some kind of sexual literacy program, and maybe this exists, and I don't know about it because that's not my world, but I too have a 10-year-old boy, and we talk about no a lot, and what no means no in all kinds of different contexts. But I thought, wouldn't it be incredible if in maybe the middle school or even a little younger, we actually had something, not sex ed, but a sexual literacy course where we're talking about these exact things. What it means to be a man, what it means to respect boundaries, what's okay on a date, what do you not have to do on a date, what are the rules, what is respecting somebody else all about. I know these are conversations that we should be all having as families, but I think it could be a really great class at a school.
As a previous special educator, I actually taught for 8 years, and we would do a healthy relationships course because it was very touchy on what you could say in a school. You couldn't really talk about healthy relationships and what happens within them. Kids are wanting to know this information.
And they'll get it some other way, right?
The average age of a child seeing porn for the first time is 8. Remember, I have a 6 and a 9-year-old. My 9-year-old has never seen porn. We are a porn-free house. That is not something that we will tolerate. We are pretty adamant about that if you're not answering the questions, they are going to be finding it. I did a lot of teaching on, my teaching was called Who Wants to Be a Porn Star? Because if we're not teaching our kids that, where are they learning it from? And please don't tell me that porn is respectful, because I sure as heck have never seen a respectful porn.
I think go ahead, Paul.
I would just say this. I think one of the ways you do the cultural change stuff is exposing what's happening, and I think that was really one of the things that I think the article did. I think some of the work that John's office did when they were doing it in Ramsey County specifically. and then having conversations like this, because I think it forces us to think, and it's easy, I think, to walk around in a world and not think about these things. And so to put ourselves in a position where we have to work through and struggle with some of these issues is one of the ways that we prompt it.
And I think on top of that, I think what we fund and what we prioritize really, really matters. And so we just naturally always, when things come to light like this and we want to do a better job, we put everything in the bucket of response. And so over time, I know that there will be more investments, and police chiefs will start making the decisions because they know that their community wants us to have more investigation. People will know that we need to have better support for advocacy, but it's all in the response area. And what we really need to be thinking about is a prevention agenda as well, to get upstream and to fund, because none of these things will happen unless there are expectations that laws create that we do this preventive work, and then we adequately fund it in our schools. So talking about some of the things that were mentioned here about introducing these concepts into our curriculum, because if you think about it, we have the attention of kids, and oftentimes parents this is a very difficult conversation for them to have. So at the very minimum, when we have the attention of young people, to start talking about some of these issues. And imagine if we could encourage, and I know there's been some efforts around this area, but just like, for instance, in sports, as someone who grew up playing hockey and baseball, I just know for a fact that how much young people look up to their coaches. And so if a coach gives license to saying or doing something that is entirely inappropriate, that none of us in this room would value, none of us in our families would ever want spoken about their mother or their sister, whatever it might be, that we need to make sure that we have the adequate training, and then we have that investment, not only in our education systems, but also in our public health departments at the state level and at the local county level, so that we're doing this work. And ultimately, when we make those decisions, and those decisions will never be made unless people like all of you are talking to elected and appointed officials, talking about how important this is for our future.
I also want to add that we also need to be talking to kids about healthy sexuality. We can't spend forever talking about what's not good if we don't also tell them what is good. And so, I think there's a lot of fear around talking to kids about healthy sexuality, and I think it's so important if we want to really shift the culture and have some important dialogues with our youth.
Thank you. Okay, this is shifting gears just a little bit. There's a question about protective orders. And the question is, how do protective orders work, and is there room for improvement to limit additional trauma for survivors?
So is everybody looking at me because I'm an attorney? So I'm trying to understand that. So we have like protective orders in the context of, stalking, harassing type of behavior. We also have it in the context of domestic violence. Right. And usually there's a certain situation that happens, and then there is some sort of motion made as a part of a criminal proceeding, or it could be also just a private harassment restraining order. So I'm just trying to, as I'm talking, I'm trying to unpack that question, how that could relate to sexual assault. So I guess if you have a stalker or a predator that you know that is after you, that those protective things are really critical. But again, at the end of the day, that's just a piece of paper, right? So that's not necessarily, it's just going to be a part of a process. So I don't know how better to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just add a bit to that.
They are important for a lot of victims to get, and especially since so many sexual assaults, it's an acquaintance. And so that order is from somebody who's close to them and they really feel they need protection from. And I've talked to a number of women, and it seems like there needs to be a lot of more help available to them to fill out the application, to the petition, I should say, to get the order, because if any information is left off of that, I'm not going to call it the right thing. It's a petition, right?
it can be denied. And really, I've seen women do petitions that are not detailed and don't put down the basic information about when they were assaulted, dates, everything. And the process could have been so much better had they had a hand in knowing how to fill out the petition to get that protective order or harassment order, restraining order. So it's really important to make sure that that anybody that might be seeking one of these really take their time with that petition and get as detailed as possible.
Right. And I think the advocacy programs are the place to start there because
Absolutely.
I think they can really help guide that and have the expertise to make that happen.
Yeah, I think having that infrastructure of support, and there are many organizations that can help victims with that process. But I think one thing that we should all be also talking about is the exorbitant fee that it costs to get one of those harassment restraining orders. I think it's about $250, and I think we should have less reliance on those fees, especially in this type of context, so that everybody has that available to them.
This is a question for all of you. What have you hoped would happen post-denied justice? And has that happened, and what has not yet happened? That's a pretty broad question.
I think there's, I hope, and I remain hopeful that that there is momentum, and I think, I just think about, just having been a police chief within the last two and a half weeks ago, I was there, and I think about the fact that my elected leaders, the people who really employed me, I think one of the things that the story did was it highlighted, I think, things that they didn't know they needed to know. And so all of a sudden now these people are coming in and saying, well, how are we on this? And I think you want to make a big difference at the local community level from a law enforcement response standpoint, I'm talking about, is that those elected leaders, I think, can be led to ask the questions that really, I think, can expose and or drive much improved practice. And I think that's one of the things that can be forgotten, because most police chiefs are very mindful of the fact that when that city council member or that county commissioner asks the question, how are we on this? It can make a big difference. And I don't think in all of the years I was a police chief, which I think was about a total of 9, not once did I get asked that until denied justice came about. And so I think it's really a way to kind of to raise up the issue.
There's a toolkit on the website of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, MCASA, for local law enforcement agencies, wherever they are, to audit their sexual assault and rape cases, to basically do, a version of what we did in our project on their own sexual assault cases, and look and try to answer that question: how are we on this? Because they don't know. That's not a metric they track. They're not, they're out being cops, and they're not, tracking all of these cases and what the outcomes are, and how thorough, all the investigations were, and what pieces of the investigation were maybe missing or lacking. They're, they don't have to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel. They can go to this toolkit and download it and get help auditing their own sexual assault cases and see where they're at on this. So I want to just put in a plug for that.
Okay.
Well, I think, what this did was, some of what it did was it kind of shined a light on some issues that many of us that are working in advocacy knew were happening. Some of the gaps that I think are still out there that need to be addressed are issues in Indian country, because those weren't really lifted up and were, and in some of the work afterwards, I think there's still some work that needs to be done to address some of the gaps in Indian country and some of the gaps for our tribal communities here in Minnesota. And so having been on the Attorney General's task force and also the post-board training committee, great first steps, and I think we still have some work to do.
Thank you. What are your opinions with how the trans rights movement intersects with the movement against sexual violence and trafficking? Is there anything the trans community could do to be more sensitive toward the inclusion of, or is there anything the community could do to be more sensitive and inclusive of survivors?
Start by believing.
I think also too, we think about these things in a gender-based binary, and we oftentimes exclude those voices. And so I think it's just really important that we're really intentional about including those that aren't necessarily as a part of the common mainstream way that we think about gender-based violence. And so I think it is, and then Nicole, you reminded us to be really intentional about that, and I think that's really critical.
And I think we need to be, again, to be really intentional when we're talking about, we oftentimes talk about sexual assault in terms of female victims, women victims, and I think we need to always be mindful that we are including our trans women and our trans victims, and that we are not excluding, and that we're lifting up those stories, because the violence in the trans community against trans women is extremely high, and the murder rate for trans women is extremely high, and I think those are stories that we're also not hearing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. This may be a question for John, or it may be a question for all of you, actually. How would you respond to people who view the statement by prosecutors, it's not worth it to file charges, there's not enough evidence, as not working hard enough on behalf of survivors?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So I think it's not so much that a case isn't worth it. Every victim is worth, and I think that my hope, actually I should say, is that some of the things that are lacking are going to dramatically change, so that when we have investigations, that there is a full, robust effort to ultimately get to the truth and then present that to the prosecutor. And I know that if we have fuller and more robust investigations, just like we do for homicide investigations, the amount of effort and work that we put into those, right? And by the way, we don't have a victim in a homicide case. There is no victim. We figure out a way to prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt through the investigation, right? And the type of investment that we make in drug trafficking cases, I know that if we can make that effort, and our prosecutors are working closely with those investigators, that we are going to be able to get more cases presented to the prosecutor and more cases that will ultimately be charged, just like what has kind of transpired as an example around domestic violence. Again, our prosecution rates back in 1990 in Ramsey County were about a little bit under 30% of domestic violence cases were charged. And so as the investigations improved, as we unpacked and addressed some of the cultural biases and eliminated some of those barriers, things improved. Now, but one thing that we can't change is the ethical standard by which a prosecutor has to evaluate a case. And if a prosecutor believes that they cannot prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, based upon the evidence that's before them, our ethics say that we can't prosecute that case. Now, I think there are ways to push that envelope, and what that is better investigations and having an openness to try to do our best to bring charges where we believe that a crime has been committed, that there is a perpetrator, and we believe the victim. And so I think just through this process that we're currently engaged in, all of those things will improve. But that's one of the things that we can't change unless we change our ethical standards for our profession.
John, I'd like to ask you a question on that. This was something we discussed, in the series with you and with other prosecutors. And what do you think of the notion that one of the prosecutors I interviewed said that prosecutors need to expand their notion of what evidence sufficient to support a conviction means?
And I agree with that. And I think that we've seen that in many advances that we've had in homicide cases, domestic violence. The investigations have dramatically improved in order for those charges to be brought.
But I think we're talking about the prosecutor's notion of what evidence sufficient to support a conviction is, I guess regardless of the quality of the investigation. But, you know, the notion of where the bar is for me to file charges. Are we interpreting that ethical standard in such a way that the bar is being set so high that you can't file those charges?
I think in sexual violence, we can raise that bar.
I would just say too that having presented many of them and some that got charged and really we went full force and really I think there's an absence of those stories as well, because I think one of the things that can happen is when there is a good response, and sometimes it may even be a really good response that there can't be a prosecution, but the victim felt that they were cared about, they were supported, there was a system that came around them. That's a story that unfortunately we didn't tell. There was one or two of them in the Denied Justice series, but I got to say that as somebody who investigated a lot of these cases, and I think back of one that was just so clear, and it was a Ramsey County case when I was in St. Paul, and by almost every measure, I think people were stunned that got charged. I think they were, when it did get charged, I went to a jury trial, and it was fraught with challenges. I mean, really profound challenges, but a really a victim who I think was incredibly courageous, felt a tremendous amount of support from advocacy, a prosecutor who knew that you know that we had what we had, and they presented that evidence, and I think in a compelling manner. And the thing that was most incredible for me was the fact that the jury believed that woman, and I think that's a story that was a reminder. It was just a reminder for me as I think back of being an investigator and working so many of these cases, that it can happen. And again, I recognize that it won't in every case, but
in fact,
it can.
we have to keep in mind that our charging rate, audience, anybody, what do you think our charging rate is when across the board? 5%? No, it's a little bit higher than that, but 65%. So in other words, 35% of the cases we are not charging because there's insufficient evidence or we don't believe the case can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. We have some issues with the potential guilt of the perpetrator or whatever evidentiary hurdle that might exist. So that's the reality. Not every case gets charged. We have to have some standards in place. Otherwise, what ends up happening is if we have a community value that says, well, just charge them. They seem to be guilty, right? And just see what sticks. Let the jury decide. That will lead to a system where we are going to have other bigger problems about due process and all of that. So it's important to have these standards in place, but I agree that in this area of sexual violence, more can be done from a prosecution standpoint to be more open to receiving and charging these particular cases. But again, it really starts with that level of investigation. Because again, historically, we have seen charging rates increase in many other areas involving sexual, gender-based types of violence. Again, less than 30% was our charging rate in domestic violence, but there was a community will, an expectation that we hold people accountable. There were better investigations, and they advanced dramatically in terms of how they're investigated. And so that's what really needs to happen around sexual assault. I am absolutely convinced if we put the time and the resources that we do today around homicides and apply that to sexual assault, we will have many more cases that are going to be charged, and we're going to be able to prove cases beyond a reasonable doubt that we didn't think today that we could.
I do have a quick question for a clarification. When you were stating the statistics of charged cases, could you give those statistics again? Sorry.
Right, so just general.
And is that in sexual?
No,
is that
just
SAK? Oh,
everything,
just
everything,
over-
across the
okay,
board. I mean,
gotcha.
in fact, 65% is the high water mark during my tenure as county attorney. In fact, when I started, it was 49% charging rate. So there were more cases that we declined than we actually prosecuted. So today, it's probably a little bit over 60%, but we've traditionally have been, during my time as county attorney, a charge rate of 55 to 65%. And I think that's healthy because not every case.
Do you know
can
what
be
it is
charged.
for sexual violence?
So, it would be substantially less. It was a part of the denied justice series. We did some reporting, I believe. Karen, you're in the audience. And Karen, by the way, Karen Long is the prosecutor who spent the time doing that two-year review. But I think it was, our charge rate was about 40% or a little bit less than 37. Yeah.
And I think you're talking about charges in cases that were forwarded to your office, right?
Right, and so then
we're
that-
not talking about cases that
Right, and
never
that's
made
another
it to
thing too,
the-
because the 2/3 of the cases that were investigated never came to our office, never came to our office. And so that's another thing that the review and the reporting has uncovered from a statewide perspective, and not
Right.
just in Ramsey County, but across the board. These cases were not being presented to the prosecutor.
So if
Okay,
you look
just-
at the,
oh, excuse me.
if you look at it in terms of a percent of the cases reported to police for sexual assault in our study of the 20 across Minnesota, criminal charges were filed in 13% of those sexual assault reports.
So just to follow up.
1-3.
Just to follow up a little bit, prosecutors represent the public.
Right.
And prosecutors have ethical standards about what they can charge and what there's an objective standard that's sort of subjective, but it's supposed to be objective. It's as objective as you can make it on what you can charge and what you can't. So what can be improved to allow prosecutors to charge more?
Just better investigations.
Better
It's
investigations.
this way that simple, and better investigations will not happen unless we as a society invest in the need for more investigators. We have more investigators who are doing drug trafficking, drug types of investigations than we do around sexual assault. I think if we had to think about the values of our society, we would say that that's more important. That's actually my hope and dream from what Denied Justice was able to uncover, the work that we did in Ramsey County, that we start making those shifts within our systems, so that we actually do that appropriate investment so that it matches where I think the public would want us to. And I'm absolutely convinced that if we put more resources into those investigations, we get those caseloads down from 300 per investigator. That's a lot of cases. Think about that. 300 individual referrals that you're responsible for, which there's an allegation of some form of, that's in your caseload. That's true for Roseville, St. Paul Police. I think Sheriff's Office is a little bit less than that, but still much too high. And a typical homicide investigator caseload would be, Paul, help me out, because, I mean, it's in a year, maybe 30, you know, if that even. That's a lot for a homicide investigator. So I think those are the things that really need to change. And if that does change, just like we have seen in many other types of crimes where we have had evolution, right? I mean, child sex abuse, that's another perfect example. The prosecutorial decisions to charge will come with that.
All right, we're nearing the end of our program. I have an individual question for each of you, and if you could take about a minute and a half, 2 minutes, up to 2 minutes to answer, that would be great. And we'll start out with Paul. And the question for Paul is this: what are the key takeaways from your task force experience in working on the issue of investigations for survivors of sexual assault?
Wow. I guess I feel that one of the things that I think was a great part of that experience is the fact that we brought together really kind of a heavy multidisciplinary group. And so you're looking at these issues from a variety of perspectives. That there was a variety of kind of strategies around kind of giving the issue importance, whether that was from an investigative standpoint, a training standpoint, a public health or prevention standpoint, an advocacy perspective. But I guess at the end of the day, and when all was said and done, I think it was a call and a reminder for us to give this the attention and resources that it deserves, to have it become more of an issue that I think the public has involvement in, that their elected leaders, the legislature, our county commission, our city councils, need to begin to kind of take an active role in and engage in, and I'm confident that that is happening as a result of this. And I think what ultimately the report did, and it was not all-inclusive. There's work that I think that we all felt, all of the participants felt, that more could be done, and we were under tight time constraints. But I think it was a start. And that's what I appreciated. It was an effort, I think, by our former Attorney General to try and honor the work of the range of people that made it up, and all of the people that we represented, whether it was advocacy or medical or public health or investigations, law enforcement. And it was a great first start. And I think now the question really becomes, what's next, and how do we breathe life into that?
Thank you. John, next is for you. With the recommendations of the task force and passage of additional legislation, do you see a better path forward in the prosecution of sexual assault cases that will not only validate the survivors' stories, but also, very important, help deter future assaults?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great things that are in the Attorney General's report. I would support all of those things, and in addition to that, the things that Mincasa is advocating for, the Minnesota Coalition of Battered Women. So I feel like there's momentum to pass some legislation, but I also want to make sure that this isn't lost. It's also not about just changing the laws, but it's also about what we fund as a state and what we fund at the local level, and what we prioritize matters. And so if you think about the investments that we need to make sure that we're funding, getting upstream, doing the prevention work, right, that we just talked about. We also need to have, if we want that robust system of response, we want to reduce these caseloads for investigators, we need to figure out ways to invest in that, have investigative grants so that we can incubate and encourage across the state of Minnesota more capacity in the area of investigations. We need to do more training around being trauma-informed and asking the right types of questions. Not, it's the wrong way to ask questions would be to say, well, what happened, and tell me, start from the beginning. If you have the proper training, there are evidence-based ways in which investigators should be interfacing, interacting with victims. If we have more resources at the state and at local level to fund more advocacy, because if we get more advocacy right after an incident, whether it's at the police station or at the hospital, building up that infrastructure is going to be really, really critical. And so I hope, as a part of the legislative agenda, but also at the local level, which is so critical, that I hope that mayors and city councilors are asking the question of their police chief, what are we doing in this particular area? How are we allocating the resources? What is the caseload for an investigator? And to figure out creative ways to fund all of that, because it will take that in order for things to change.
All right, Nicole, what are the key takeaways for advocacy from the task force experience? What would success look like?
Again, I think, to echo what Paul was saying, I think it's, having the collaboration with so many different partners at the table, I think is certainly one of the big takeaways. I think, for advocacy is to work in partnership with other community systems agencies and our law enforcement and prosecution. And, but I also think that, we're not just going to prosecute sexual violence away, and we need to be looking at prevention. To what John was saying, about what do we fund? If we're not funding prevention and really looking at, going a little bit farther up and looking at what is causing this world that we live in, that we have such high rates of sexual violence, and we have such high rates of sexual violence in particular communities. So against Native women, we have very high rates of sexual violence. And so I think we have to also look at what are the prevention efforts and what are we focusing on and what are the conversations we're having and what are the community efforts that we are taking on to really address the prevention of sexual violence.
Thank you. Jennifer, what are your key takeaways from the Denied Justice Project, and were you surprised by the experience?
That's a great question. I was surprised by the whole thing from start to finish. I was surprised by how little I knew about rape, though I thought I was a, educated woman and feminist. So it was learning from go on this. So key takeaways. One key takeaway was I hadn't fully understood the serial nature of this crime, that most rapes are committed by somebody who has done this before and will do it again. And that has profound implications for law enforcement when they're dealing with a suspect. And I hadn't really appreciated that. I didn't understand that before. Another key takeaway was the incredible bravery of the victim survivors who came forward to talk to us. I was deeply moved by their stories and their willingness to share the most frightening thing that had ever happened to them, with us. And it helped. It helped this series a great deal. Another key takeaway was about law enforcement. I was very surprised. This is kind of a mundane thing, but I think it has implications. The records management systems of the different law enforcement agencies don't talk to each other. So a lot of the police departments and sheriff's office, they have their own records management keeping systems, and they can't, if John Doe is a suspect in a rape in Roseville, they don't know that John Doe was a suspect or investigated for a rape over in, Coon Rapids or Eagan or wherever it might be. Once it gets to the point of charges being filed and it enters the court system, then that information can be shared. But below that, below the charging level, they aren't being able to track the patterns of these perpetrators, of these suspects. And that, to me, seems like a huge problem that needs to be addressed. And I know there are some agencies in the east side of the Twin Metro area that are working on that. Paul maybe can say something about that. I think those are key takeaways.
Thank you. Sarah, after the Denied Justice Project, the task force recommendations, and the legislation introduced and to be introduced in the Minnesota State Legislature, are you optimistic that more people will be willing, to come forward to report sexual assaults in a timely manner? If you could wish for something to encourage reporting, what would it look like?
I will say that when I first started my advocacy, we were at a report rate of 18%, which is horrible. The current report rate, I believe the last time I looked, was 38%. So I would say we've made progress. Are we at 100%? No. But conversations such as these and the wonderful story that was written opened a lot of eyes, and I think continues this conversation that needs to happen. I pray that nobody else ever has to go through what I went through or what many people have gone through. And the one thing I do want to say is you are strong, you are courageous, and you are inspiring, and I will stand with you always.
Thank you. This concludes tonight's program. Thank you to the panelists, to League of Women Voters St. Paul, and to League of Women Voters Dakota County. Also to Steve Brunsberg and everyone at SPNN for making this event possible. And most of all, thank you to you, the audience, and the viewers for your interest and engagement in this difficult issue. League of Women Voters is a nonprofit organization that never endorses any political party or candidate. Its mission is to make democracy work and includes voter education such as this event. Please watch for future events hosted by League of Women Voters. Thank you.